Thank you, Pastor. Greetings, dear brothers, fathers in Christ, sisters in Christ. It's always a pleasure. So, Sasse was the first one to really call out the Nazis publicly in the church, and he did it in 1932 in the Kirchliches Jahrbuch. It was a kind of an annual published by German Protestantism yearly. Sasse took over its editorship from an older guy, remarkably, and then unremarkably he began to use it, of course, for a theological critique of culture and all other issues. And he says of the Nazi Jewish paragraph, "One can perhaps forgive National Socialism all its theological sins, but this Article 24 excludes any possibility of a dialogue with the Church, whether Protestant or Catholic. Rosenberg's myth of the 20th century, for all its blasphemies and its extravagant nonsense about the history of religions and of the world, is a harmless and venial lapse compared with this article. The same can be said of the whole theology of the swastika and the messianic cult of the Führer. Evangelical theology can enter into dialogue with the National Socialists on all the points of the party program, even about the Jewish question and its understanding of race. It may perhaps be able to take seriously the whole of the rest of the program. About this article, however, no discussion at all is possible, for the Protestant Church would have to begin such a discussion with a frank admission that its doctrine constitutes a deliberate, permanent insult to the, quote, German race's sense of decency and morality, unquote, quoting the paragraph, and hence that she can have no expectation of tolerance in the Third Reich. According to the Protestant doctrine of original sin, quote, the newborn infant of the noblest German descent, endowed in body and mind with optimal racial characteristics, is as much subject to eternal damnation as the genetically gravely compromised half-caste from two decadent races. And we must go on to confess that the doctrine of the justification of the sinner, sola gratia, sola fide, is the end of German morality, just as it is the end of all human morality. We're not much interested in whether the party gives its support to Christianity, but we would like to know whether the church is to be permitted to preach the gospel in the Third Reich without let or hindrance. Whether that is, we will be able to continue undisturbed with our insults to the Germanic or Germanistic moral sense, as with God's help we intend to do. Of course, Hitler came to more or less absolute power 1 year later. It was in that same piece that Sasse goes on to talk about government. The piece is titled "The Church and Political Powers of the Times." I haven't translated the whole thing, but I'm glad you asked me to come speak because I forgot I had translated a lot of it once upon a time. I still have to finish it. And he raises the issue in the article that political questions came to dominate the thinking of people, and the people were no longer moved by doctrinal, dogmatic, or church questions. What does this process of politicization mean? What finally is happening with these powers, which today wrestle for rule in Germany and whose influence upon souls appears to be greater than the influence of the church? As philosophically based worldviews, the older of them came to exist in the first half of the previous century. Marxism and the great conservative and liberal democratic doctrines about society rose between 1830 and 1848 upon the debris of the great philosophical systems of the Enlightenment and the classical period. German political life never renounced this philosophical background. To this day, among us, political membership is a matter of worldview. The political worldviews have been embodied in the parties whose heyday came in the years after the German Revolution in 1918. Their powerful mass organizations have in this parliamentary democratic episode of our history usurped rule over the state for themselves. Their power finds the most striking expressions in the press, whose proper goal is no longer reporting news. One of the chief tasks of the editor is the concealing of facts rather the formation of mass opinion and of mass will, using every means of suggestion at its disposal. Today, the old form of parties, and thereby the parliament, for the parliament is long since only present for the sake of the party, appears to have survived. The democratic nature of the party must indeed take into consideration the voters, which the party wants to win, but that will become superfluous the moment the mass has been assembled and its rule accomplished. Only the individual can think and decide. The mass will relieve a person of the trouble of thinking and from the agony of decision. It wants to be led. The idea of the Führer and the idea of the mass belong together. Worldview is more and more surrendered to the Führer. It reaches into the past and becomes progressively more primitive. Compare the rich thought of the older systems, perhaps of Karl Marx and Friedrich Julius Stahl, who was an expert on Lutheran issues of government, with the ideological content of the present party program. There's today no party which does not live from the thought of the 19th century. Only the Führer concept is new, along with the rhetoric. Now it's no longer an issue of productive thought, but rather the creative will, not about worldview, but forming the world. Embodying this one will and equipped with a plenitude of power, the Führer elite transformed the antiquated apparatus of the party into the new form. It's a living movement in which the masses, a great following of once isolated, atomized individuals, now associated, entrust themselves to the Führer. It is not because they completely approve of his goals, which they don't even know, only he knows where he is leading us, but because they believe in him. The mystery of the Führer, the deep compulsion toward leadership by the Führer, resides not in the human greatness of his individuality, not in the great richness of his ideas. How weak are the effects of all political leaders of the present, Mahatma Gandhi and Benito Mussolini, perhaps the only exceptions, when one compares them in this respect with their predecessors in the previous century. Rather, in the power of his will, in his ability to organize masses and carry them along, and in that indefinable mystery of Führerdom that mocks any psychological explanation. If you just take a serious look at the great and really successful political leaders in the present time in all parties, you'll come to the conclusion, a century ago, no one would have followed these men. I mean, that's quite a critique. There's also, which I won't go into, quite an incredible critique also on our political era and age. Sasse was a confessor, and he wrote a piece in 31 or 32, The Confession of the Church, and it was the first article when Logia was founded. It was the first article on the first pages of Logia, and in that article, Sasse explains that there are three parts to confession, and the great word is homologeo. Homo, the word which is more prevalent than any other word in the world today. You know what that means. And logeo, logine, to say. Homologeto, to say the same things, to speak back to God. It's like Nagel's preface in Lutheran worship. And it's used in three significant ways in the New Testament, and they came to John in the River Jordan, ex homogeistai, to confess their sins or confessing their sins. Then there's the second way, the confession of the content of the faith. He who confesses Jesus is Lord, believes in his heart he's been raised from the dead, shall be saved. Jesus, who makes the good confession before Pilate, is mentioned. So in the New Testament. And then thirdly, there is the confession of praise. So that in, for instance, Matthew 11, Jesus says, I praise you, Father, that you have hidden this from the wise and revealed it to the babes. The word there is homologeo. I confess you, Lord, that you've done this. In Romans 15, there's also a section where Paul says that in the end times, the Gentiles will praise the name of God. The word there really is confess, homologeo. And these three parts of confession always belong together. If you don't confess sins, there's no need for a Savior. If there isn't the confession of the content of the faith, then it just fizzles away into nothingness, as Sasse saw from everybody to Ritschl, to Harnack, to Bultmann. And he draws a straight line between those famous theologians. And then if there is no confession of the praise, then that is a faith that is truncated, is dead. And so he will also always be interested in liturgical practice, liturgy. Lex credendi, lex orandi. The law of believing is the law of worshiping or liturgy. And he says those two must be reversed. Lex orandi, the law of praying or the liturgy, comes, and then lex credendi. And of course, in many of his studies, he particularly say Mary and the Pope, on the cult of Mary, letter 17 to Lutheran pastors, he notes how dogma arises often in the East and becomes well-rooted in the church's practice, whether it's excellent liturgical practice or not, whether it's false dogma or true dogma, and then comes to be dogmatized, usually in the West, later. Not too much has been said or written about Sasse's early years. He's born in Sonnenwald, 1895, not terribly far from Berlin. His father was a pharmacist, and he says not to have lived before World War I was not to have known how wonderful life could be. He was baptized August 1895, Hermann Otto Erich Sasse, the son of Hermann Wilhelm Heinrich and Mary Magdalene. He was born on the 17th of July in Lower Lusatia, Germany, at Sonnenwald. He was confirmed in 1910 by Berlin Friedenau, Pastor Gornant. He attended public school at Lage in Mecklenburg and attended the gymnasium at Lübeck, Breslau, and Berlin. He entered the university in 1913, University of Berlin. At that time, the university was the veritable apex of 19th century liberalism, which bore the marks of notable theologians, Schleiermacher 100 years before, to Harnack, the present great theologian. You remember Harnack wrote Das Wesen Christentums, the essence of Christianity, in 1900 and 1901. 3.5 years long, Sasse studied in this optimistic, liberal environment, saturated with German idealism. As a schoolboy, Sasse writes, I had fallen in love with the Greek language and literature, especially with those poets and thinkers who have a definite religious background, such as Aeschylus and Plato. Thus, he enrolled under two faculties, theology and philology, study of languages, and he concentrated, according to his account, in New Testament and patristics. The names of his university lectures read like an honor roll of German scholarship at the beginning of the 20th century. My main work I did with Adolf Deismann, he says. And it was from Deismann, the great philologist, that Sasse later recounted that he learned to love the language of the New Testament and the Greek-speaking church. He also taught Sasse, quote, a deep appreciation for the Septuagint. Deismann's extraordinary contributions to the understanding of the world of the New Testament, as well as Koine Greek, by bringing forth his papyri discoveries, are well known. As Kümmel has pointed out, however, Deismann's discovery of the common nature of the Greek New Testament aided the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule in further denying the uniqueness of the New Testament and its Christological message. Deismann himself complained that while Jesus' messianic consciousness was, quote, ultimately the core cause of the formation of a new religious community, later centralizing upon the person of Jesus was unhealthy. So in most every case of Sasse's teachers, they did not believe the dogma or the dogmatic content of the New Testament, including the Gospels. They did not believe the historical content. So for For Deisman, it was always about some kind of power, not doctrine, which really rather emphasizes differences, but the power and the extensive and intensive working that the communion of Jesus with God has from generation to generation. Deisman was asked about what Paul's Christology means, and he says, well, basically ignore all the details about Christological relationships, divinity, all those kind of things, and think in terms of a boat, a paddle wheeler, and when you're on that paddle wheeler, you're not paying attention to all the rods and shafts and engine and everything else and the parts. What you feel is this. That's the essence of Paul's Christianity. Well, these guys were quite simply brilliant, fabulously educated Schwärmer. They are pietists. And they had, most of them, very deep piety, as we'll see with the case of Harnack. I'll never forget what I learned from Ulrich von Wilhelminitz Mehlendorf on Plato. He was an expert in the tragedians, Greek poetry, Pindar, Aristotle, and even Plato. Old Testament I did with Baudisson, Gressman, who later, as dean, conferred my first academic degree on me, and Eisfeld. These were the guys who were responsible for the source theories of the Old Testament that became such a sore spot in the Missouri Synod's history by the 1950s and 60s. Gressman distinguished himself as an expert on ancient Palestine, concentrating on archaeological studies. In the opinion of one Old Testament scholar, he and Gunkel were primarily responsible for the development in the field of literary criticism and the form critical method, or Gattungsforschung. Their objections to the positions adopted by the Wellhausen School included accusations of a lack of vision and disregard of the archaeological and psychological discoveries. But yet, they argue for the stories in the Old Testament are nature myths in many cases, or other myths taken over by the Old Testament writers. He had several other teachers he comments about in his reminiscences. He says, my main teachers in church history were Harnack and Hall. Hall was an extraordinarily gifted and capable man. He had a complete grasp of the Eastern Church, and in addition was fluent in Russian. In 1896, he was appointed as assistant to Harnack at Berlin. He left to assume the position in Tübingen in 1900, but returned to Berlin in 2007 as a professor of church history. He prepared a masterful edition of Epiphanius and was thoroughly conversant with the ancient fathers as perhaps few others in history. He turned his attention to Luther early in his second term at Berlin. In 1907, he raised the question, what has the doctrine of justification to say about modern man? Say to modern man. This is the beginning of the 19th century Luther Renaissance. But the re-emphasis of Luther's doctrine of justification really falls on deaf ears until 1917, at the end of the war. At the height of liberalism, no one any longer knew what sin was, much less man's need for justification. In 1917, Hall's message began to find acceptance among the scholarly minds of Germany. The war had now shattered the idealism and optimism which ruled only 3 years before. On October 31st, 1917, Hall delivered the lecture which began the rebirth of Luther's studies in the 20th century. What did Luther understand by religion? Sasse was present with many of his comrades in arms. He had already been in the army since 1916. The next day, Sasse and a company of 120 men went into the battle at Flanders, one of the worst battles of World War I. 6 returned alive. Sasse was one of them. He always maintained the highest regard for Hall. By the way, Sasse, many years later, when he was being feted by the Concordia Springfielder, that is, the Springfielder for his 50th anniversary of ordination, I think, he wrote to Hank Kadai about the congratulations. He said, I felt much like I did coming back from the battlefield in Flanders when they said, Lieutenant Sasse, we buried you yesterday with full military honors. But Hull, in stressing that early Luther did not fully grasp the doctrine of justifications. Even Hull's great lecture of 1917 did not encompass full understanding of the sola fide, but took the untenable position that we are declared righteous on account of what we are to be in the future. And Sasse also complains about Hull's work often smacking of a heroic interpretation of Luther and the Reformation. And Sasse, though he later in life would be reduced to tears talking about his great teachers, recognized that Karl Hull really leaned toward Calvin's views on the sacraments, and that he really was not finally a reliable guide. But nevertheless, Sasse was there at the beginning of the Renaissance and recognized it. In Adolf Harnack, liberal theology reached its height. He was the shining light of the greatest university, says Sasse. His father was really quite a conservative Lutheran. His father read his great Dogmensgeschichte and wrote his son, Adolf von Harnack, a letter saying, I no longer see the work of a Christian in this book. He had done his doctoral work on Gnosticism, and he was interested in Marcion, of course, who rejects the Jewish aspects of is the ancient heretic, rejects the Jewish aspects of the Gospel and Old Testament. He remained, by the time he was called to Berlin, he had already gained great notoriety, especially for his great history of dogma. Harnack was a student of Ritschl. Ritschl brought Kant's rejection of metaphysics and emphasis on ethics into theology. So theology is not a matter of metaphysical, spiritual things that God does. It's really ethics. And Sasse will say later that there's nothing unique in Jesus' ethics. There's nothing in Jesus' ethics, love your neighbors yourself or whatever it may be. There's nothing in Jesus' ethics which you can't find in other religions. The uniqueness of Christ is the sacrifice of the God-man for the sins of the world. So for really, Harnack does not believe anything in the New Testament actually happened, really, none of the miracles. Harnack reduces the New Testament to the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer, basically. While being a very pious individual who was aghast that he was removed from a review board for those who were to be ordained for the ministry. Not to have lived before 1914 is not to know how a happy life can be. The war changed everything. Strangely enough, the greatness of the University of Berlin epitomized the demise of Lutheranism. When Sasse was lining up for military service, men were asked by a Silesian officer. They were being divided into Catholics and Lutherans for different divisions so they could be handled religiously. And there were some left that had gone to neither line. And the sergeant says, "What are you?" And atheist, comes a reply. "So you believe nothing? You're a Protestant, over here." But a theological revolution was approaching as far-reaching in scale as the approaching political upheaval. The Jesus of Harnack, the religious genius void of all dogma, would give way to the Chalcedonian Christ of the New Testament. A half-century later, Sasse put in words the great anxiety of 1914. Sasse says, "Now, what has happened in Europe? I remember the 3rd of August, 1914, the University of Berlin was celebrating its commemoration day. The 3rd was the day that King William III had established this university as the great university in which the ideals of Germany would be realized. At the time of Napoleon, when Germany was in the lowest ebb of its political existence, the power of the mind, the great power of German idealism, was to renew the German nation. This was the idea that the great University of Berlin was founded on. It was on this 3rd of August that the commemoration was held in the Great Assembly Hall. Outside on the avenue, the troops marched. war had broken out. And on the platform, one could see the great masterminds of German science. There was, for instance, my great teacher, William Mahlendorf, the teacher of classics. He couldn't stop the tears. He knew what was going on. Beside him was Edward Norden. Norden was my teacher in Latin, and every New Testament man knows him as the investigator of the liturgical language of the ancient world. Already on that day, when the assassination of the Crown Prince of Austria became known in the end of June 1914, he said to us on that Monday morning, "I am not able to concentrate myself on a lecture in Latin." He used to give his lectures in Latin because he wanted to have students who really took their subject seriously. And then he started into his lecture in German. He said, "This will be the great catastrophe of Europe." Now this catastrophe came. We saw the faces of Harnack, of Deisman, of Karl Hull, the colleague of Harnack. We saw the great scientists and medical men. Bonhoeffer, he's talking about Bonhoeffer's father, who was a lecturer at Berlin in science, and others. We saw the lecture platform of Max Planck, the great physicist and the creator of the human theory of the quantum. He gave his academic address as an Archimedes, not regarding what was going on in the military and political world. He spoke of the great problem of the principle of causality in modern physics. Must this principle be given up? Anyway, to make it long and short of it, Sasse basically goes into the trenches, as I already mentioned, and he says, we went into the trenches reading Pindar and Sophocles and came out reading our Greek New Testaments. And there was a huge turn. Karl Barth was formative in that turn for Sasse and many others at the time. Karl Barth started raising the question, what shall I preach? In other words, if you have this optimistic 19th century liberalism, which needs no incarnation, it needs no sacrifice for sins, what do we have to preach? Now, post-World War II, the question is ever more acute, and Barth writes his commentary on Romans, raises the question in 1917, 1919. And many of these young pastors whose entire hope in science, philosophy, sociology is completely dashed, began hearing Barth. The preface to Barth's Romans commentary says, Barth says, if I had to make a choice between the modern, our modern understanding of the Bible as myth and that of our Orthodox Protestant fathers, I would choose the latter, which was shocking, because Barth is a student of Harnack as well. It shocks the world. And there's this renaissance in Lutheranism begins growing. And the people it affects are who? Werner Ehlert. And all of the great names that come through the 30s, Althaus, many other names come through the 30s. It affects these men. And they are turned more and more toward Luther. How much time do I have? I've just finished the opening paragraph. How late will we?
As much as you need.
Really? That's dangerous.